My name is John Cairns. I am the new campaign coordinator for Scottish CND. I came into post at the beginning of this year, and it's been a huge learning curve, a wonderful learning curve. I'm working with a great group of people on what I believe is a very important subject. And yeah, I hope to get to know as many people as possible soon. This evening, we're speaking to Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who is the author of the report, What Does the TPNW Mean for Britain? And our subject this evening is, what does the TPNW mean for Scotland? Dr. Johnson is the Executive Director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy and the founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which received the Nobel Peace Laureate in Geneva in 2017. Dr. Johnson has written many articles, books, etc., about diplomacy, open democracy, banning nuclear weapons, and over 4 decades of feminist peace activism. In addition to the educational work and lectures with Acronym, she serves on the panel on fissile materials, IPFM, and the international steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. We're very fortunate to have Rebecca with us this evening, especially given her great knowledge of the whole wide range of issues that affect us and affect nuclear disarmament. So I would first of all like to welcome Dr. Johnson, and she is going to speak for about 10 minutes to fill us in on the background of this report. Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome also to our team at CND and Scottish CND. And I actually want to start by enormously thanking CND and also Scottish CND and the Nuclear Information Service, NIS, CND for having the idea of my doing a report like this, for NET, the Nuclear Education Trust, and also I want to give a shout out to Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for covering some of the research and the writing, and especially the NET for the printing, not the printing, but the design and production of the report. And Nukwatch and others, and Janet and others for reading, for providing photos, David Cullen, Peter Burt, and Trish Whittam, especially for quite a bit of research assistance and proofreading and so on. So the full title of the report is Nuclear Weapons Are Banned. What does this mean for Britain? And I'll start by saying a bit of the context. The first sentence of the executive summary is, nuclear weapons continue to threaten the world with nuclear war and terror. And the first sentence or couple of sentences of the introduction are, as humanity struggles to address the enormity of what we must change to avoid further deadly pandemics and the worst outcomes of climate destruction, nuclear risks and the spectre of nuclear war are on the rise again. And these 2 points are really fundamental to why it's so important that we're taking on this issue, and that we recognize that this is one of the, existentially threatening issues to our lives and survival in the 21st century. There are over 13,000 nuclear weapons still in the possession of the nuclear armed states, of which there are now 9. Also, we know that regional and international relations between some, if not all, of those nuclear armed states are deteriorating, and they've been deteriorating for the last 2 decades. We know that nuclear weapons can, in fact, be dismantled and got rid of, because 50,000 nuclear weapons were removed, dismantled, destroyed since the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, the one that we were working so hard on down at Greenham Common and up here in Scotland. But those reductions have practically stopped. And instead, what we're seeing are new upgraded warheads and missiles being developed, including here in the UK. And we particularly see this in the 2021 Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, what I've called in the report IR 2021, which increases the risks of nuclear use and proliferation by widening the circumstances in which nuclear weapons can be used and raising the ceiling on the nuclear arsenal of the UK by 40%, as well as other steps that undermine the UK's previous commitments on transparency, nuclear disarmament, and verification. And from the UN Secretary General's office right through to the Archbishop of Canterbury, deep concerns were raised about this from right across the world and also from other states parties within the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's also an important part of the context. Now, what does this report do? Well, chapter 1 gives a commentary, a detailed article by article commentary on the TPNW text, its relevant negotiating history and the implications of some of the decisions and choices that were made. Chapter 2 analyzes the evolution and changes in UK nuclear policies, going back actually quite a long way, but particularly focusing on the period from 2006, when the decision was brought up in the white paper by the Labour government of Tony Blair about renewing Trident. And this is when I came up and started living in Scotland for a couple of years as part of the coordinating team for Faslane 365, because we knew that so much depends on what happens in Scotland as to whether they can do this or not. And that was living in Scotland and then getting involved really in direct action of Faslane. And what were they talking about? They weren't talking about arms control. They were talking about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. They were talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were talking about preventing any use of nuclear weapons, preventing the accidents, preventing the risks. And it just really woke me up to recognize that that's what we had to focus on to get to the next stage of nuclear disarmament, and that the obvious next stage of nuclear disarmament was getting a treaty that would ban nuclear weapons. To focus on that, that's why we call this whole process a humanitarian banning, a humanitarian disarmament process, because it focuses on taking the value away, on stigmatizing, on banning the weapons. And in the case of this treaty, it bans the use and the threat of use, because what is deterrence but threatening to use nuclear weapons by doctrine and therefore by practice? Because to do that, you have to make the weapons, you have to deploy them, you have to have all kinds of nuclear policies, you've got to be assisted in all kinds of different ways. And every time those nuclear weapons go out on deployment, they are a nuclear war waiting to happen by intention or accident. So that's really what chapter 2 tries to kind of show. Chapter 3 looks at looks at 5 scenarios that, in discussion with some of you, we felt that these were the ones that would or could pressure political change in the UK, and starting with security and economic imperatives. Now, that ought to be the sole reason, for pressure to get rid of nuclear weapons, shouldn't it? What is right for our security, and can we afford it? And not only are nuclear weapons completely wrong for any aspect of security, you cannot protect anyone with nuclear weapons against any of the security threats. In fact, nuclear weapons are not an asset for security. They are a problem and a threat. And we can't afford them. The economic pressures, we should be putting all those resources and the skilled workforce into, you know, green energy, into tackling climate destruction, into tackling pandemics and so on. So that's what that scenario is looking at. The second one is the one that I can remember at Greenham, we constantly were told, oh, you'll never get nuclear disarmament unless somebody uses nuclear weapons or unless there's another dreadful accident like Chernobyl. Well, that may be true, and it's known as the shock theory of change. But actually, I argue that we partly have created the shock by the process of getting this treaty being, focusing people's attention on the humanitarian catastrophe that would occur if nuclear weapons are used, focusing them on the risks, on the nuclear dangers, on all the things that could go wrong, and frankly, probably will go, some of them have already gone wrong. We've been pulled back from the brink many, many times. And if we carry on having nuclear weapons, we're not going to get past it.
I'm sorry, Rebecca, 2 more minutes.
Got it, thank you. So the third was decisions by Scottish voters to go nuclear free and independent. And I'm sure I'm going to get quite a few questions on that. The fourth was what happens if NATO partners start to join the treaty? You know, people like to join things if their friends are doing so. And what are the implications and some of the arguments around the pressures on NATO here and now? And finally, the last, which again should be, you know, relevant, elections deliver parliaments and governments that are able to carry out nuclear disarmament and accede to the treaty. And then chapter 4 really owes a huge amount to John Ainsley of Scottish CND, really looks at his research and just summarizes some of it on the stages, the requirements, the possible timelines that a UK roadmap for disarmament would entail. As to recommendations, there are 5 key. Now, obviously, we all really want the recommendation to be UK, get rid of Trident, cancel the renewal, get rid of it, and join sign and join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and, you know, contribute skills to verification and disarmament. But we've decided to focus on the fact that on the recommendations, because we know the government in the UK is not ready, that they have existing legal obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. So what they need to start doing in earnest, in good faith, is taking the steps that in nuclear disarmament, we can talk a little bit about what those are, to comply with their disarmament and non-proliferation commitments. The second one is for the Westminster and Scottish parliaments to undertake separate parliamentary investigations to determine what would be entailed in pursuing nuclear disarmament and joining the TPNW. And I hope we can talk about that in a bit more detail. There's 3 more very short recommendations. There's participation in the first meeting of states parties. It's currently still scheduled for March of 2022. It may end up being postponed, but we don't know that yet. We're calling on the UK to apply and attend as an observer, and we're calling on members of parliament, and we know that some Scottish members of parliament are going. We really hope there'll be more. I think Bill Kidd is going. I think Kirsten Oswald had said something about going. So participation in the first meeting of states parties is the third recommendation. The fourth is one that will be music to many of your ears because you're already doing it. And it's the role of civil society and elected representatives, and to know that we can exert real influence. And we can do that through the nuclear-free cities, and making more and more of them. And we can do that through divestment, Don't Bank on the Bomb, and the Churches Together investment program, and so on. And finally, it's just one for Scotland, is I'd like to see the Scottish Government consider reconvening the Scottish Government Working Group on Scotland without nuclear weapons that brought together activists, including myself as I was living in Scotland then, academics like William Walker and others, trades unionists, quite a few trade unionists, the churches, faith leaders, and so on, being chaired by, it was at that time Bruce Crawford, a senior member of the Scottish Government. I think we need to have that now, and I think it needs to be done. That's got a separate brief, if you like, very Scottish-faced focus brief, as well as that second recommendation that there should be a full parliamentary investigation with expert witnesses and so on. So I'll leave it there and open it up to, because I'm dying to hear what your questions are.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and I am sorry for interrupting you.
That's your job.
The format for this evening now, I'm going to ask Rebecca a couple of questions and then we will open it to the floor. The event is due to take about an hour and a half, and we hope to finish round about 7 o'clock. Okay. First of all, Rebecca, you're talking about the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. People are saying TPNW replaces NPT. It's maybe NPT has failed even. Would you agree that TPNW actually strengthens the aims of NPT? It shows that the objectives are still relevant and that most people in the world want to strengthen those aims.
Absolutely. I've actually attended every single NPT meeting since 1994. I'm one of the very few people in the world probably who has done that, and I've reported on all of them. It was an important treaty to achieve at the height of the Cold War, and we must never forget that. But it also has problems because there was a lot of control exerted by the US and by Russia in particular, that absolutely watered down. In fact, they didn't even initially want to have any commitment to nuclear disarmament in there. They wanted it just to deal with non-proliferation. So they watered down the Article 6 on nuclear disarmament until it really was sort of to negotiate in good faith. And nevertheless, that is a legal obligation on Britain and all of the nuclear armed states. All of the nuclear weapon states as defined, as described in the treaty. What the TPNW does, and remember, it was really launched at the 2010 review conference of the NPT. We had a strategy to get 2 key paragraphs into the 2010 final document dealing with the use of nuclear weapons and the humanitarian, international humanitarian law, and also that conclusion of the ICJ that there exists an obligation to negotiate and bring to conclusion nuclear disarmament. And we used particularly the phrase that had been used by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon about a nuclear weapon convention or interconnected he didn't say it had to be just one treaty. He talked about it being possible as a framework of treaties. So it's really been built out of that, and all of the states that actually negotiated it are NPT members. And the treaty is very explicit. It's there to build on, to strengthen, and to implement the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation obligations of the NPT. And I'm particularly saying that because we're not obliged to implement Article 4 on nuclear energy, because that isn't a core obligation of the NPT. It was the incentive mechanism within the NPT to persuade countries that they wouldn't lose access to nuclear technologies. They wouldn't be stopped from getting nuclear technologies if they joined the treaty promising not to acquire nuclear weapons. And we need to understand that. So the TPNW has a lot of the practicalities in it, like the NPT never dealt with the use of nuclear weapons at all. It doesn't prohibit the use. That's key to the TPNW. Plus all those activities, production, testing, deployment, assisting others to do these activities that could enable anyone, not just states. The TPNW actually applies to non-state actors, to civil society and non-state actors of a non-civil kind, which is very, very important as well, because the NPT only applies to states officially. And so the TPNW gives us a stronger, better toolbox, if you like, for what we can do to get implementation of the TPNW, which would in fact become and mean full implementation of the NPT.
You're muted, John.
Thank you, sorry. My second question is to do with scenario 3 and the role of Scotland. And quite a lot depends on Scotland becoming independent. Do you think the rise in international tensions, such as in Ukraine just now, might make people in Scotland less inclined to vote for independence, and therefore the removal of nuclear weapons, or even to make a change in our position within NATO?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. And I think that's one for the Scottish people to answer. But my analysis doesn't, it refers to nuclear free and independent because, of course, that was the phrase used by Pacific Islands way back, going back when I was doing all my work with nuclear testing. And things are clearly connected in the minds of a lot of Scottish people. But we do have to recognise that the Scots people have been opposed to nuclear weapons for a very long time, right across all the parties, except perhaps the Tories. You know, so what my analysis is obviously recognising that if Scotland had an independent government that had the power to actually turn around and say to the UK, you know, you are not going to be able to use Faslane and Coulport, you know, and our roads and seas for your nuclear weapons, then that would just be a massive game changer. But as you can see, I think from my analysis, I actually think that the Scottish opposition to nuclear weapons is a game changer, even without independence. And I think that it behoves the Scots to really recognize how much power you have. And that's, you know, I quoted, you know, military experts in that scenario 3 actually saying, you know, if the UK cannot, Coulport is far more crucial to the UK carrying on with nuclear weapons than Faslane. There are possible places that could be used. There's Plymouth, I think Ailsa has suggested something about Falmouth. Those things have been looked at, and you know, back in 2001, William Walker and Malcolm Chalmers looked at some alternatives. There are alternatives where the submarines could go. There's no alternative, and the military acknowledges this. There's no alternative for what Coulport does. And that's really pretty critical to understand, and why that is. So, you know, I feel that, you know, it's for the Scottish to take the positions in terms of independence. I think that the route to having the freedom to sign the TPNW would come much more quickly through Scottish independence. But I actually believe that Scotland already has the power to make it impossible for the UK to actually ever deploy Dreadnought. Now, the problem with that kind of second version of it is that the UK government would probably have squandered more and more billions and billions and billions of people's hard-earned money on the Dreadnought submarine system and on keeping, you know, Aldermaston and Burfield making the weapons, on keeping the nuclear warhead convoys going up and down on our public roads between Burfield and Coolport, endangering all of us. That, without Scottish independence, all of that process will take longer, I think. But it is still possible for the Scottish people to make happen. And I think that that's very important for people to recognise.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think it is important to realise that independence makes the removal of the nuclear weapons simpler, but removal of the nuclear weapons is not necessarily dependent on independence, and that people should be aware of that. They're potentially two separate issues. I also think it's extremely peculiar that the UK government thinks that making a British overseas territory within Scotland is so completely insane. But that's just my comment on that. According to your report, I think it seems that a major change in the normative perception of these weapons is necessary to achieve complete abolition. But is that sort of level of change not linked also to a change in perception of the dangers of climate change, sustainability, global poverty, and global finance? How prepared do you think the organisations and the individuals who are working are prepared to come together to promote these global interventions as one unified goal?
I actually think it's been happening over a period of time. And I'd like to give a shout out to XR Peace, for example, which is the peace wing of Extinction Rebellion, because we came together specifically. A lot of us were doing the blockades for Extinction Rebellion in 2018 and 2019. And in 2020 decided, well, actually, we need to do this explicitly and show just what is the carbon bootprint, the carbon overload that comes from military activities all over the place. Recognize all military activities are carbon intensive, very, very dangerous. And obviously out of that, there is the nuclear bootprint. And so, XR Peace was there to actually try to bring different parts together. And I actually had a picture from a demonstration we did outside BAE Systems during COP26 in the report. I can see a couple of people smiling who were there. And because this is important and we need to make that even stronger. And at the same time, we as, anti-nuclear campaigners need to much more explicitly be ourselves making common cause with the climate activists. And that's particularly also, I think, the climate activists are driven by the young people. They can see their futures being just sort of burned away through climate heating. And whenever I talk to these young climate activists, and we've actually brought climate activists and young nuclear activists together as part of ICANN meetings in Paris, and I know Janet enabled us to bring climate activists from here in Scotland, and we brought some from the Salisbury area, or one from the Salisbury area, and together with a whole lot of, at that time, European climate and nuclear activists. That's really, really important to do that. And every time I talk to these amazing young people, I just get reminded of how we were back, in the 1980s, just deciding that we had to go down to places like Greenham Common and Faslane and make those fundamental changes in our lives to get rid of the nuclear weapons that were a sword of Damocles hanging over us with the Cold War and with that new generation of Cruise and Pershing and the SS-20s on the Russian side. And we have to see, this is sort of, there's a film, in fact, called Mothers of the Revolution that a New Zealand director brought out. And it starts with some of us looking very, very impossibly young, it seems to me, doing actions at Greenham. But it ends on a really amazing call to action, showing people like Greta Thunberg and other young climate activists, showing people like Rose McGovern, who took on Harvey Weinstein and other sexual predators, and which is also connected in with this, showed campaigners against poverty, campaigners against pollution, campaigners against the destruction of the forests from across the world, and to a great soundtrack. That's how the film ends. And we have to just get into the schools with films like that, and the films that are coming up from, with Setsuko Thurlow speaking at the UN. There's an animation film of that. We've got to get to the schools with those things, and with, I think there's a couple of climate films coming out with young people in it. And we've got to get that education, making those connections. Scotland probably makes those connections more than most places in these islands that I know. We have to do so much more south of your border, but there's still a lot of work for you.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's enough of my questions. I know we have others coming in. First of all, I would like to invite Bill Kidd, MSP, to ask his question. Bill had a motion before the Scottish Parliament last Thursday, a very interesting debate, which very strongly supported the motion, and which Bill was correctly complimented for his commitment to nuclear, to the abolition of nuclear weapons. So, Bill, would you like to put your question, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Can you hear? Yeah, if you can hear me, okay, that's fine. And thanks so much, Rebecca, again for everything you're doing. The report is brilliant, as expected. And as far as I can just mention very quickly, is that the members' debate that we had there last week, that obviously was very much heavily in favour of nuclear disarmament. That's the third members' debate I've had on that. And in all cases, it has been going in that direction. So the Scottish Parliament is consistent with this, and I believe consistent with what the Scottish people want us to say anyway. Rebecca, can I ask, and I put it in the chat there actually, can you see a route through the TPNW for the signature states to actually be able to pressurise and work together to pressurise the nuclear nine, to effectively reduce and eventually, hopefully, achieve nuclear disarmament by them? Because I think it seems to me from the work that you've done with ICANN and the work that other civil society organisations have done, that this has brought these 122 nations and so on together in this direction. But it always seems to be that the US and etc. are putting the pressure on other nations, smaller usually economies, to do what they want. Do you think it's possible for signature states to band together and work to pressurise the nuclear states, please?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I actually think that is happening through the TPNW. And not just in normative ways, but in legal ways as well. It's really significant to notice that the majority of the cities and states, by states I mean like the US states like California, and the counties here and so on, the majority who've so far joined the cities appeal, I think in one of the ICANN reports looking at NATO, said that there are about 400 of those in, I apologize if I've got that number wrong, but it's the correct number is in my report, I can tell you. About 400 cities from NATO countries alone, as of the end of last year, had aligned themselves with the ICANN cities appeal. Now, that's fascinating. The very early sort of motions tended to be just motions of support, but increasingly they began to bite more and more. And this is why I actually focused particularly on the New York one, because I thought that this is one that's really clear, where it is saying it has two central obligations that the city of New York is now obliged to carry forward, and they're practical, that they're within the remit that they can. One is education on how you disarm nuclear, on not how you disarm nuclear weapons, how the importance of nuclear disarmament and all its aspects, and the TPNW. And the other is requiring divestment from nuclear weapons. And that's increasingly been brought in. And I know that, MedAct has done some really good work and has issued some kits for councils that make those kinds of practical connections for the city's appeals to also deal with the divesting of nuclear weapons. And that's really putting pressure. That's putting concrete, practical pressures. Now, we have to make those concrete, practical pressures work not only on all the NATO countries, but work beyond. Now, there, obviously, we have our colleague Sharon Dolev and the Middle East Treaty Organization that really took a leaf out of the TPNW happening to, and had, I think, its very first sort of meeting in Edinburgh. I think that Bill, you and Janet and Gary Dunn at UN House Scotland made that possible and kind of hosted that meeting. That's obviously meant to be a process that includes Israelis, Iranians, and other scholars and activists from the Middle East to look at how they can actually get that Middle East free of nuclear and other WMD, that zone that was promised back in 1995 through the NPT. But, Meto and Sharon's work is really putting some practical flesh onto that. And it's so key that it's actually got Israelis as activists and Iranians as activists, as well as the Arab, the states from the Arab League. So that's something else where I think there's some hope, and that, the pressure is on there from various sources, but I actually think the TPNW can help to provide a context to really make that move forward. Then I look at India and Pakistan, where you have two nuclear armed states, regional rivals right next door to each other, complicated also by there being China and China's rivalry with India and China on the borders and so on. And that's the other thing to kind of recognize, that no nuclear armed state is an island all of itself. They're all interconnected. But when the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty came in, both India and Pakistan did decide that they were going to try to slide in before the treaty, the CTBT, locked them out of any testing. It was supposed to lock them out of any testing in 1996. But 2 years later, they each did a small number of underground nuclear tests, and then they themselves declared themselves nuclear weapon states, which is a phrase they can't do legally in terms of the NPT, but you understand why they did, because they were saying, we're nuclear armed now. But immediately after they got some pressure, they mutually, bilaterally, if you like, they agreed to a moratorium. Also, when they nearly went to nuclear war, when they actually had a period of time later in 1998 and 1999, where there was rhetoric about, I can bomb more of your cities than you can bomb of mine. It was horrendous, and it was, over Kashmir, but it was a lot more than that. They shot themselves. That was their Cuban Missile moment. And they pulled back and they started saying, we actually have to communicate with each other. Now, interestingly, both India and Pakistan came to some of the early conferences, and they were pressured to some of the earlier humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons conferences, I should say, in Oslo and Mexico and Vienna. Now, the NAM, the non-aligned states, so-called, that's a kind of UN term that was developed during the Cold War. But it's really a lot of the countries that did the negotiations in 2017 came from what used to be called Third World or Global South states, and most of them are still connected with the G77 or the NAM, or, you know, these terms change. India and Pakistan are both connected in with that, as is North Korea, by the way, interestingly, which a lot of people forget. So there are ways in which their neighbors and their colleagues and, you know, and other countries, and there's also a nuclear disarmament and peace movement in India, and there are scholars who work on fissile materials and disarmament in Pakistan. So we have a toolbox. We can argue for bilateral, where you have that kind of rivalry. The treaty is clear. It's about unilateral. It's a national decision by each of the nuclear armed states. The treaty provides a way out of, you know, some of those nuclear armed states. They're like hamsters stuck on a wheel. Britain is I actually think Britain is stuck on that. You know, Sir Michael Quinlan said in 2006, if we didn't already have nuclear weapons, we would not be talking about getting them now. And that was back in 2006. They're on a treadmill. They're stuck in that. And they're scared to jump off. It's like jumping off the back of a tiger, I think they think. And that, you know, so the toolbox from the TPNW and the context and the multilateral context of the TPNW, and the fact that more and more states are joining it, and the fact that they are offering to, and that they are requiring that states take national decisions, but that they can do it bilaterally. Britain and France can do what we did with the CTBT, which is, you know, I don't know how many of you know, the UK and France actually kind of held hands and ratified the CTBT on the same day, because they were sort of rivals in a sort of sense, but they also wanted to take the lead before the US was ready to ratify that treaty. So what I'm saying here is there are a lot of opportunities that the TPNW opens up. I don't think we should be holding our breath for the P5 to do the negotiations, so-called P5, which I call in the treaty the NPT5. And I like your nuclear 9, because there are 9. The N9, the nuclear 9, I would like to see some things like an end to the production of fissile materials actually being negotiated by a smaller group that includes the nuclear 9 and includes some of the allies of all of them, maybe a group of about 21. And that's part of one of the, you know, I'm on the International Panel on Fissile Materials. We've got representatives from, I think, all of the 9 on that panel. And we're committed also to the TPNW, and the Princeton group, as some of you know, has done some tremendous work on verification issues and institutional issues for the treaty, for the TPNW, that are being discussed by states parties in advance of the meeting on states parties. So that's what I mean when I say a toolbox, because it really offers practical ways forward on that. And I was just noticing, by the way, and thank you to, who is it, Marion from Pax Christi has alerted us that Pax Christi International has a series of short videos that link climate and nuclear weapons. So sorry that I hadn't got that. And Bill, I want to congratulate you before I leave this question of yours so much on getting that debate into the Scottish Parliament on Thursday. I mean, great timing. I was sent some notes from it. It was Thursday, and I was going to have to work through the night to get the final design things done on the PDF. So I haven't yet looked at it, but I'm really looking forward to it, because I gather it was a very good debate, and just big congratulations to you and your colleagues for making that happen, and you know, bringing it to the attention of all the members of the Scottish Parliament. I wish we could get that kind of debate, cross-party initiatives, things like that in the UK Parliament. But we've still got some way to go there.
Very kind of you, and thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks for your answer. It was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And interestingly, I think in terms of Scottish independence, one of the great things about MITO, the Middle East Treaty Organization, is that they're very clear they want the Middle East to solve its own problems. We'll take control of this, thank you very much. And I think there's something, a takeaway that Scotland can find in that. We've had a question in from Will Thompson about the TPNW. How can the TPNW work when states that possess weapons refuse to accede to the treaty? But I think you have really covered that in the previous question. There's a couple of interim questions, a general question that's come in from a few people. Should we back efforts to encourage the nuclear armed states to adopt no first use as part of a process to them signing TPNW, hopefully?
Yeah, that is that's a question about which there are a number of different points of view, I think, because the treaty itself, of course, prohibits the use and the threat of use. But as your previous question also raised, the Nuclear Nine haven't joined it. Now, I had got to a certain point. I used to absolutely advocate for no first use agreements among the five, among the nine. We should also recognize the five are so obsessed by their status with nuclear weapons. Let's never forget, status is a massive kind of facilitator of nuclear proliferation. It isn't really about security. And if you read my report, you'll see that Blair is pretty explicit that, you know, when it came down to it, he and Gordon Brown decided that they weren't going to be the people that went to Parliament and said, you know what, we're not going to have nuclear weapons, you know, and status was the thing there. And for the five, it's wrapped up somewhat with them having the status of permanent seats on the Security Council. I personally definitely, support reform of the Security Council. But the truth of the matter is, those permanent seats were delivered to those five when only one of them at the time was a nuclear armed state, and that was the US. The others did not have nuclear weapons. They were the ones that sort of came out of the Second World War as the ones that hadn't been utterly defeated. And actually what we think of as China, the People's Republic of China, didn't take that Chinese seat until, I can't remember exactly when, but it was good 15 years after China was nevertheless named as one of the permanent members of the Security Council. So we have to delink those things. That's an important point. On no first use, I think that now that we have the treaty that unequivocally prohibits use and threat of use of nuclear weapons, we can encourage unilateral and possibly bilateral US, Soviet, or India, Pakistan kinds of agreements on no first use. We should encourage no first use to become part of their policies. And we can do that without that in any way conferring a legal right for second strike. That's the big danger in my mind. And that's why I absolutely oppose any attempt to have a treaty or a negotiation on a no first use agreement among the five or among anyone else. Because that would absolutely undermine the core prohibition that is in the the core prohibition that is in the TPNW. It can only be done unilaterally or as a bilateral agreement, but it would be a confidence builder. Now, do I think it's going to happen? Well, I spent many years hoping that it would, supporting it in conjunction with de-alerting, with taking nuclear weapons off alert. The thing about no first use is it's what's known as declaratory policy. It's, China still has a no first use, but China's current arsenal is actually being built up now to be able to do a first strike. And so a lot of the analysts in what I refer to as the military, industrial, bureaucratic, academic kind of establishment that surround all of the militaries in the nuclear armed states, and quite a lot of the militaries within NATO and Australia and Japan as well. They are all saying now that whatever China's declaratory policy of no first use is, on the ground, they're completely equipped, able, capable of a first use. And that's a big problem about declaratory no first use statements. Then we had the UK saying back in, what was the year, 2000, I think it was, saying that they'd reduced notice to fire to days rather than minutes, and that they detargeted. But did that mean they couldn't retarget and fire? Would that, it was declaratory policy. And in fact, they can retarget and fire Trident on the instruction of the Prime Minister and the Chief of Defence Staff within around 15 minutes. It's operationally possible to fire first from, the submarines, regardless of what the doctrine is back home on paper. And that's a real problem. And so one of the things that we're looking at, and I think that John Ainsley again did really interesting work on, was what would you do on a submarine physically, operationally, to make it impossible for for a submarine, either inadvertently, or if if the captain or a group of the submariners went doolally, which is obviously always a possibility, to stop nuclear weapons being fired. Now, if you combine no first use with practical, operational, physical steps that interfered between the guidance system and the warhead, in effect, or disabled the missile, and the missile had to take 2 or 3 days to be re-enabled or something like that, then actually you might have a combination that would raise confidence. Otherwise, frankly, no first use, to a very large extent, it's purely words. It's declaratory. I know some of our colleagues in the US are really pushing for it. The problem with those things is that if they get it, that's probably all they're going to get out of the Biden administration. And that's not enough.
Thank you, Rebecca. I hope Elizabeth Raichler and Sue Wright don't mind that I'm kind of going to combine their question. Sue Wright's point is that education is vital, but how can we get the conversation going in the UK media to educate the general public? And Elizabeth's question is it not possible to get the UK to announce that it will go as an observer to 1MSP, as Norway and Germany have done? And the reason I'm combining them is, if the UK government were to go to 1MSP, it would be all over the newspapers. And the argument for signing the TPNW, would be much more out there for people to debate. So how do you feel about those questions?
Yeah, I think they're both very, very important. I mean, we really thought that that the Guardian, we were in conversation with the Guardian. The report was initially meant to be launched on the 10th of January during the NPT review conference, and before it got postponed, and we really thought that we would get an exclusive, and the Guardian seemed very interested. One of their key journalists based in Washington, who done that very interesting article on nuclear decision making and how scary it is, the 15 minutes to fire article, Julian Borgia. We really had hopes that we were going to get an exclusive. And it was quite late on Thursday when we were basically told that because of Ukraine and Boris, you know, because of those two things, really, were mainly Ukraine for the people doing the work on international relations in London and in Washington. This, you know, basically the editors weren't going to do it, and this goes to the basic issue. It is so hard to get media. And that's part of why I really draw attention. I include the media in the MEBAs, the military industrial, you know, media, bureaucratic, academic, you know, these, it is an establishment, and you get preferment if you're willing to call nuclear weapons the deterrent. You get preferment. You know, all the theories, you know, I go into it in detail in the report, so I won't here, and I'm going to be doing some more work and more research on that now that I've got this report out. But this is a real problem, and in some cases we just have to depend on that Scottish media actually does cover these things, but then the Westminster, you know, south of the border media often does not pick up on the stuff on the media covered by Scotland. So what can we do? I can only say we have to keep trying on all levels, but local media is something not to forget. So every time you do an action, and I hope, you know, the treaty's entered into force, but let's face it, it's still there. And quite a lot of you were doing actions on Banniversary on Saturday. I think we need to get better now that, particularly now my report's out, it's actually, and it's going to be printed, and get it to your MPs and get local media to see you hand them a copy of the treaty. By the way, there's a copy of the treaty in the report. So you know, that's, you know, in the UN blue at the end of the report. You know, hold a meeting with your MP, give them my report. It's got a great cover that'll look good, and make that into local media coverage. Do it with a group of you, maybe on the, you know, whenever you want, actually. But if you do a cities appeal, if you haven't already done one, do it then. Or do it for the meeting of states parties, particularly if it happens in March. You know, and you can do it more than once too. So if you get things into local media, actually more people read local media than read The Guardian or The Times or The Telegraph. It's just that they're diverse everywhere. So that's something for everybody to be doing and to keep doing. Let your media know when you divest from nuclear weapons, or you know, you take a campaign to get your union or your council to divest. Get a little media hit, get it into union publications, get it into, you know, all of those things. We have to be much more creative, because the national media is too tied into the way that nuclear weapons are presented as you know, really as essential in UK politics, and they're not, and you don't have to. And then the other question was about the UK to go as an observer. Yeah, I think this is really, really important, and I know the CND, and I think we should also in Scottish CND be putting as much pressure as possible for the UK to go as an observer. But I think they probably won't. We'll all get letters back saying that they won't. But make sure that your members of Parliament go, members of the Scottish Parliament, and your Scottish members of the Westminster Parliament. And for those of you, because I know there are quite a few people joining this who aren't from Scotland, make sure your MPs are going to that. You know, get Keir Starmer there. You know, get Caroline Lucas there, get, who's the Lib Dem guy, Ed something. You know, get...
Ed Davey.
Ed Davey, thank you very much. You know, or get your local MPs to go, because we are hoping, unless the meeting of states parties goes hybrid, which is a possibility, we're keeping our fingers crossed it won't happen, but it may be that they hold only the states part of it in person, and that no civil society and therefore no members of Parliament can go. But as the plans are currently there, there are events being organized for the members of parliament, being organized by the Austrian parliamentarians. So again, get your MPs there and then have a smiley face of you and your local group holding the report with its, title on it saying nuclear weapons are banned. What does this mean for Britain? Because it's all in writing. We decided to put no missiles, no submarines on the cover, just that stark message on the cover. So that was that question, I think, as best as I could answer it.
Thank you very much. And I think I should tell you that I have always been an amazing fan of product placement. So going on and coming back to Scotland, we have a question from the Edinburgh Yes Hub volunteers. How can Scotland make more use, even before independence, of the strength of the international movement against nuclear weapons, as expressed in the ratifications, the signing, and the consistent support of the UN? How can we bring that international movement to bear in Scottish politics?
Yeah, I think actually I have to say, my hat goes off out completely to Scottish CND, to Scotland's for Peace, UN House Scotland, Yes Hub, all of you, Faz Lane, a lot of Scottish members in XR Peace as well, and all of that, because that's what you've been doing. You've been inviting people, like Alexander Clement, people like me, international campaigners like, Ray Atchison from WILPF and from ICANN, of course. You've been inviting people to your meetings, and you've been getting media coverage, and you've been, really giving us platforms to talk to, members of parliament in the Scottish Parliament, and all of that work is wonderful, and just keep going. There's, really that has to keep going. When we're able to go back to in person, but there's more we can still do on Zoom, and in fact internationally you can get some great more international speakers, and I'm hoping that my report is going to really provide a resource and a tool to do it, because I worked very hard to kind of look at it from so many angles and bring it very up to date on the, it's a commentary on the actual treaty text, and everything's referenced, because I'm so sick of having part of the MEBA establishment just turn around and say, oh, but the treaty's just this, that, and the other, and it doesn't deal with verification, and it doesn't deal with the NPT is thinner, much thinner than the TPNW, doesn't have anything about implementation, anything about an institution, anything about verification. It's got the safeguards which are only applicable on the non-nuclear countries that join, and so on. The TPNW is halfway, if you like, in terms of its detail between the NPT, which is absolute bare bones stuff and had to have all that kind of added on, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which dotted practically every I and crossed every T, but unfortunately hasn't entered into force because it fell foul of rivalry among the nuclear armed states. So when we think about that, that's what we have to have in play. So thank you to all of you campaigners in Scotland, because I think you really have engaged. I would definitely engage a lot more with Ireland as well, because Ireland was a heavy lifting on the TPNW, showed what a small island nation that is a member of the EU, but has refused to join NATO, as indeed has Austria refused to join NATO, but, does quite a lot of stuff with NATO states of other kinds, but never to do with the military and nuclear side. Ireland, the UK is very fond of saying we punch above our weight. I hate that phrase, but if you want to think of any country that in diplomatic and international terms is really way above, has influence way above its size, you'd look to Ireland, you'd look to Norway, you'd look to Austria, you don't look to the UK. We are diminishing. We are diminished by the fact that we have nuclear weapons, and we don't see a way out of our dependence on military production of all kinds. I mean, don't get me started on BAE and Saudi Arabia and selling arms to despotic countries that have the most appalling human rights record in the world. But you can find all of that information on CAT. So Scotland really, if Scotland's for peace, Scotland actually could play such an important role in being a peacemaking country that has influence internationally way beyond what either the UK based in Westminster has these days, and more along the kinds of lines that Norway or Ireland or Austria show. And let's not forget some of the others like Costa Rica and Mexico and New Zealand as well. Some of these smaller countries really have a lot of diplomatic, peace building influence. And, that's really, I think, where there's a lot of hope in where Scotland could be heading.
That's great, thank you. Moving on to an environmental question now from Bill Ramsey. Mini nuclear power stations, the small modular reactors, are being marketed by some as a contribution to the solution of climate change, to the extent where the EU has decided to subsidise both gas production and nuclear power stations. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I sat at a meeting, it was a Zoom meeting, but the meeting that was coordinated by the FCDO, I think it was late November, early December. It was meant to be kind of preparing for the NPT review conference, and that's when they brought out their Global Britain. And it was just after COP26, and they actually boasted that that the UK had the biggest stall promoting nuclear energy of any displayer in COP26, and they were proud of that. So small nuclear reactors, they have a number of problems. Every single small nuclear reactor is a nuclear bomb waiting to be attacked. We've got cyber now where, reactors can be taken over and use, but don't ever forget that still a small nuclear reactor can be bombed from the air or bombed by a conventional missile that flies below the level of radar in the event of a war situation. And if you bomb any nuclear power station or any nuclear reactor at all, you will get, at the very least, plutonium dispersal. And if you want to know what that's like, ask the Aboriginal people of Maralinga, because the UK did plutonium dispersal testing during the 1950s in Maralinga and destroyed the health of Aboriginal communities on their ancestral land, on a wide swathe of their lands. And that has never been cleaned up properly. This is why the treaty also has such important provisions, Articles 6 and 7, on the assistance to all the survivors and their descendants, and the remediation of environments that have been affected by nuclear use and testing. And in ICANN, we are absolutely pushing and saying it's got to be use, testing and production. We fought for that in the negotiations for a variety of reasons. That production didn't get put in the treaty for the remediation side, but because production is prohibited by the treaty, we can bring that in. That might seem like a digression, but it goes to this issue of small modular reactors, because back in the 1950s, Eisenhower brought out Atoms for Peace because the big mushroom clouds from the nuclear testing were putting people off nuclear technology altogether. It was a PR job. We do not need any kind of nuclear power station, small, large, or in between. The only thing that I would make a caveat around with this is the very, very small research reactors within universities and so on that make medical isotopes, for example, because those are very, very small indeed. And medical isotopes have a genuine role still in our health. But nuclear as an small modular reactors, or even new nuclear build that Boris is keen on, or that EDF from France are keen on, and Russia's keen on, and China's keen on, and India's fairly keen on, and all that pressure. This is just PR to try to get through the fact that the pressure is on to get rid of nuclear altogether, weapons and the very dangerous Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island creating and Fukushima disastrous zones that have arisen when things go wrong with nuclear power plants. And an act of nuclear terrorism is still on the cards and is still usable against the small modular reactors. So just say no. It's not a solution. It's part of the danger. And and whenever you have those things as well, you're keeping the nuclear industry, or rather you're keeping the nuclear technologies ticking over. And that's why tackling fissile materials is so important to me. That's why I'm part of the international panel on fissile materials, so that we don't have nuclear fuel, like take the AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK thing. What we're offering Australia in that is a nuclear powered submarine along the lines of Dreadnought. That's what's being offered to a country that is a non-nuclear weapon state within the meaning, within the description terms of the NPT. You start, and we're not talking even about low enriched uranium. This is enriched uranium that is highly dangerous and could in fact be used to make a pretty dirty nuclear bomb. Not an efficient one, a very dirty one, but a very destructive one nonetheless.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. Brian Drummond is making comments in the chat. And I just wonder, Brian, if you wanted to ask something yourself, to unmute yourself and ask Rebecca a question.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes. Brian. Thank you.
No, thanks. I was really just responding to things that people were saying about first use. I think just, well, to ask a question to Rebecca, I accept what you say about not distracting the issue with the issue of no first use, when that's not necessarily going to lead to the complete disarmament that we're looking for. But is there an argument, well, I have obviously presented in various articles an argument that the UK is, regardless of the fact it's not signed the TPNW, it is legally obliged to change its policy to have no first use. When I started out in this process, I would have preferred to get to the answer that they were legally obliged to not have nuclear weapons, but I couldn't get there. And this was as far as I could get. And therefore, I think that I think that there is a case for putting legal pressure on the UK to change its policy to no first use on a unilateral basis.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for putting the link to your article in the chat. And I will take a look at that article. I have seen quite a lot of articles making this going right back quite a long way, actually. And I think most recently, people like John Wolfstall, I think, has pushed hard on this in the US. I have to say, bottom line, and I think you put in your chat, if you're arguing for the UK to introduce a no first use agreement, please stop. we do not want a no first agreement with any other nuclear armed states, because the legal issue that will come up will be very confusing, because the way those things work, the government is going to then argue that it is going to co-opt that. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because
so Rebecca, could I just come in? Sorry, that was a typo in my chat. It is not an agreement. I put an agreement, but what I actually meant to write was policy. I am purely arguing for a unilateral policy. I accept the point about agreements, and I would not argue for that.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Brian. So I don't object to it, but I wonder how much energy we want to put into it, and I'll say why. Because the UK and the US and France and China and Russia exerted enormous pressure. But the UK and France and the US and Russia in particular, when the International Court of Justice was doing its analysis back in the 1990s. And the moment that the ICJ had that very equivocal aspect, it had one unequivocal, it had the unanimous that said there exists in law, there exists an obligation to negotiate and bring to a conclusion, which was a clarification of Article 6 that was helpful, and that was unanimous, and that was very good. But on the issue of use, the way the ICJ ended up dealing with it, and that's why it's so important in the report that I actually quote from Judge Bajawi, who was the president of the ICJ at that time, because when he attended the Edinburgh conference, that Janet Fenton, who's here now, and also Angie Zelter and I, out of kind of the Faslane 365 team, we organized a conference in Edinburgh at, what was it called? That lovely Earth Home place. Anyway, we organized that, which was on Trident and international law. Essentially, what does this mean for Scotland? And we had quite a lot of legal people coming to it, and then there was a massive snowfall not in Scotland actually, but in that just covered southern England. All flights cancelled from what was it called, Heathrow, and it was Philippe Sands was going to fly up from Southampton, all that sort of thing. But nevertheless, we did have Christopher Weeramantry, and Judge Bajawi had submitted a paper to it. And in it, Angie had asked him the very specific question about a 100 kiloton Trident warhead. Would that have met the criteria that was part of the equivocation? And Judge Bajawi said at that time, and we put it in the book, Trident and International Law, that this would not have met that criterion of supreme national interests or extreme circumstances. And but what we actually found, and this is why I'm saying this, Brian, is because the minute you get an agreement like that, just like, how many times does the UK, the Westminster government, trot out that that nuclear weapons are no longer targeted? All that means is it's a computer change. And it can be retargeted, as I said earlier, in 15 minutes. They also trot out that they have several days' notice to fire. And they trot it out to get lots of brownie points every time they turn up at an NPT meeting. But it actually doesn't mean real change in their operations. And so no first use would not mean real change in any UK operation at all, unless it went along with some of the de-alerting practicality, operational things that John Ainsley talked about. If it doesn't entail those, don't give them that, brownie point, because they will use it, and they will use it against the TPNW. They will use it against all of us. So make them deal with the fact that what they have every time Trident goes out, they have the ability, the capability, and the option to fire it first, second, or last. And none of those firings is legal under international humanitarian law at all. If you take that explanation from Judge Bajawi about the 100 kiloton, none of it is legal under the TPNW either. And the TPNW stigmatizes those uses, and therefore also then the deployment of nuclear weapons under, you know, the nuclear deterrence doctrines, because that is deployment with the purpose of threatening to use nuclear weapons. That's what it is. And that's why the Trident III dumped the computers overboard back in 1999. Ellen and Ulla and Angie, it was precisely on the grounds of that. And I argued in their court case that, and as you know, they actually got acquitted. And then of course an appeal was taken and they lost the appeal. So, you know, be very, very careful about unintended consequences, Brian. And I'm afraid that I think, I haven't read your pieces, so I would need to read them in detail. But I think that what you're arguing for could very well be counterproductive and certainly could really undermine what we're trying to do to bring the to get the UK to take the TPNW seriously and also to implement its existing obligations under the NPT. It's, you know, no first use is it's called declaratory policy for a good reason. It ain't worth the paper it's written on, except for the nuclear armed states that want to keep producing and making and deploying nuclear weapons. Then it's worth them having, because it's in their interests to have.
Thank you both very much for that. I'm sorry, Brian, it's just that we're coming very close to the end of our time, and I'm sure these conversations, that's such a cliche, but you know what I mean. We've got an awful lot to talk about and not enough space to talk about it in.
That's fine, thanks, John. That's fine.
Thanks, Brian. As I said, I think we should perhaps draw this to a close. I did have a question about the momentum that we feel is happening internationally and here in Scotland, and how can we build on that and keep it going. But to be perfectly honest, Rebecca, I think you've answered that. And it was, I would encourage everybody to take that advice, particularly in terms of contacting local papers and local MSPs. Where they go, the nationals, I think, will follow. So just to finish off tonight, thank you all very much for coming. If you are not already members of Scottish CND, please do join us. If you're not in Scotland, please join Scottish CND. And I hope I haven't offended anybody by saying that. And finally, thank you very much to Rebecca Johnson for a wonderful report and a wonderful evening.
Can I have a tiny last word, please?
Yes, of course. Of course.
Because I just want to thank all of you for all the work that you are doing here. I also want to draw attention, I think Lynn has put this article from Andy Sterling and Phil Johnson into the connection on civil and military nuclear infrastructures. Their work is brilliant on showing what this connection is. But really, this has been a really great number of questions, a great conversation, and we have to just keep having it. And I am available to take part in any meetings that you want to organize. I don't mind how many come or don't come. If you want to organize it with your local groups, you know, with XR Peace or with XR local groups, get groups together locally, do it on Zoom. I'm very, very happy to be part of those kinds of discussions, because that's how we can move forward. And, you know, all power to your voices and your activism and your, you know, just commitment and authority, moral authority, as well as humanitarian authority.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And also thank you very much for your work and how important your work is, and being so committed to making the effort to come and see as many people as you can. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed this evening. And I look for, this is the first of a series of events that we are hoping to introduce from Scottish CND. I hope you'll join us again in future. So thank you and good night.